Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jeff Whitaker, the new president and CEO of Chevy Chase Trust. It is my pleasure to introduce Walter Isaacson to you all. Walter is a professor at Tulane University. Previously, he's been the CEO of the Aspen Institute, chair of CNN, and editor of Time magazine. He's a remarkable author and thinker who's explored themes of genius, contribution, and human achievement in a series of outstanding books. Being the subject of an Isaacson book is the definitive statement that you have moved our species forward in a truly meaningful way. That's certainly the case with The Codebreaker and its central figure, Dr. Jennifer Doudna. In The Codebreaker, Isaacson tells the compelling story of Dr. Doudna and the development of gene editing technology. It's a field that's advanced at breakneck speed over the past decade, and it's had a material impact on our ability to address the current pandemic. He also uses this incredible story to explore a multitude of themes, including competition and collaboration, the nature of genius, the ethics of how we employ scientific discoveries in society. It's my pleasure to introduce Walter Isaacson.
Hey, thank you so much, Jeff, and it's great to be with all of you at the Chevy Chase Group and to talk about innovation and creativity. Because as you said, Jeff, I've written about a lot of smart people, but one of the things I've learned is that smart people are a dime a dozen. They don't always amount to much. What matters is being creative, imaginative, to be able, like Steve Jobs, to think outside of the box. And to me, there have been three great innovation and creativity revolutions of the modern times. The first, they sort of go back to the fundamental particles of our existence, which are the atom, the bit, and the gene. The first was based on the atom, and I wrote about that with my Einstein book, and it leads to things like atomic weaponry and space travel and GPS and many other things. The second, the bit, was a binary digits. In the second half of the 20th century, you get the digital revolution when the microchip, the computer, and the internet are all interwoven. And finally, now, I think we're getting to what will be an even more significant innovation and commercial and entrepreneurial revolution, which is the life sciences revolution, in which molecules will become the new microchip. We're seeing that with the vaccines we're getting, where they've programmed RNA to be a messenger to help vaccinate us. And likewise, we see it with the gene editing technologies I'm going to talk about, in which RNA is programmed to decide where to cut our genes and to make edits in our genes and our DNA. And I did it through Jennifer Doudna, a wonderful, persistent, smart, charming woman. I met her a few years ago, and I was looking for a way to get into the notion of this life sciences revolution. Because I believe that if you tell things as a narrative, if you tell it through a person, it becomes a journey of discovery. And that's what this book is about, but that's what our lives are about, is journeys of discovery, helping to figure out new things and understand things. There's a real joy that comes from understanding something, especially when that something is ourselves. Jennifer Doudna, when she was in 6th grade, came home one day and found that her dad had left an old paperback book on her bed. It's called The Double Helix by James Watson. And Jennifer put it aside, thinking for a moment that it was one of those detective stories that she loved. And so she saved it for a rainy Saturday. And when she picked it up, she realized, well, she was right in a certain way. It was a detective story. It was a detective story to find out the secrets of life. Now, Jennifer Doudna shared with all the people I've written about, from Steve Jobs back to Leonardo Da Vinci, Einstein, Ben Franklin, a trait that is at the key to creativity, and that's just curiosity, pure curiosity, the type of curiosity we all had in our wonder years before grown-ups started saying things like, quit asking so many silly questions. Jennifer grew up in Hawaii. She was a tall, lanky, blonde girl from the mainland in a small town in which all her classmates were Polynesians. So she felt like a bit of an outsider. And like outsiders, she always asked, how do I fit in? Where do I fit in? And so she studied nature, why the seashells had those curly squiggle, curled up, or why the sleeping grass, when you touched it, it folded. And she said, there's got to be secrets inside of life that are mechanisms that make things work. So when she read the Double Helix, she was fascinated that DNA is the code that tells us every protein in our body, whether it's the hairs or the neurons or the hormones or whatever in our body, all the proteins, there's a blueprint, and that's the DNA. And that figuring out the structure of DNA is what led Watson and Crick to launch this new life science revolution I've talked about. She also noticed that there was a character in the book treated a bit condescendingly named Rosalind Franklin. Watson called her Rosie, a name she never used for herself. And Jennifer read it and said, oh my goodness, girls can be scientists. And she decided she would. But her school guidance counselor told her, no, girls don't do science. Well, the good thing about Jennifer Dowden is she persisted. She realized that, yes, it was something a woman could do. So she decides she's going to focus on biology and chemistry and the intersection between the two, and goes off to Pomona College, becomes a great chemist. And then when she goes to Yale, starts focusing on this molecule known as RNA. All the men at the time, all the great male biologists in the 1990s, were racing to the soccer ball like they do on soccer fields, which was DNA. It was the Human Genome Project. And people from Eric Lander to Francis Collins, both famous now, and Craig Ventnor and others, a lot of alpha males, were all sequencing DNA. But Jennifer said she liked to sometimes play soccer by going to where the ball wasn't, playing the positions others didn't want to play, knowing what the future was, where the ball might be going. And so she studied RNA, which is sort of forgotten, or was the forgotten sibling of DNA. DNA is, of course, far more famous, but it doesn't do a whole lot of work. It just sits in the nucleus of our cells, curating our genetic information. RNA actually does work. It goes, it makes little copies of the information in the DNA, and then goes to the region of the cells where proteins are built. And it says, build this protein. And she discovered the structure of some of the types of RNA, just as Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin had discovered the structure of DNA. And when she discovered the structure of RNA, she gets to one of the first big questions. And she learns that creativity is about asking the big questions. She discovers how RNA could replicate itself. In other words, how it can make copies of itself with nothing else helping it. No proteins, no nothing. It just could copy itself. And that addressed one of the great questions of the world, which is, how did life begin on this planet? And it meant that 4 billion years or so ago, in the primordial stew of chemicals on our planet, RNA was the molecule that begins life on this planet. It sort of comes together and starts replicating itself. And later, DNA and proteins are formed, but RNA is the key to life on this planet. As an expert in RNA, she got to meet other people, mainly women, who are experts in RNA, not chasing that DNA soccer ball. And she met at Berkeley, where she had become a professor, a woman named Jillian Banfield, who was looking at something odd, something known as CRISPR. You don't have to worry about what CRISPR stands for. It's an acronym that basically talks about clustered repeated sequences. And people had found those clustered repeated sequences in bacteria. When they sequenced the DNA of bacteria, they found somehow or another there were these repeated sequences. Nobody quite knew why. A young graduate student in Spain figured out, wow, look, what it does is those clustered sequences have copies of some of the genetic material of viruses that attacked that bacteria in the past. Now, you think we got problems with viruses. bacteria have been fighting viruses for more than 1 billion years. It's one of the great wars on our planet. And the defense mechanism that bacteria came up with is this CRISPR system that takes a mugshot of any virus that attacks it, and then as the virus comes back, it has a scissors, known as an enzyme, a scissors that gets guided to cut the attacking virus. It adapts every time a new virus comes along, which is just, of course, what we need in these days of recurring virus attacks. So Jillian Banfield calls up her friend Jennifer Doudna, and they start looking at these RNA snippets that guide the scissors in CRISPR systems in bacteria and in other places, in test tubes. And what Jennifer Doudna discovers with her research partner, Emmanuel Charpentier from France, is exactly how simple that system is. It's just a guide RNA and an enzyme that acts like a scissors, and it can go wherever you program it to go to cut DNA. Wow, Jennifer says. There was an aha moment when all that happens, and that aha moment is we can use it to edit human genes. She gets into a race to prove that it can edit in human beings, a race with Feng Zhang and Eric Lander at the Broad Institute at Harvard, MIT, George Church at Harvard, 3 or 4 other labs. They're still involved in a patent battle. They're still involved in fighting over who gets the credit. But the Nobel Committee said, Jennifer Doudna, Emmanuel Charpentier, they're the ones who made this discovery. And so to me, this was a persistent, smart, out-of-the-box thinker who thought visually, Jennifer Doudna, and she became the perfect central character in explaining how we got from here to there. But she also did 2 other things that made her an interesting hero and main character in my book. First of all, right after she discovers how you can use this system to edit human DNA, she has a nightmare. And the nightmare is that she goes into a room to meet somebody who says, I want to understand your discovery. And the person looks up and it's Hitler. And after that, she was so shaken that she begins the process of gathering scientists and ethicists and philosophers and spiritual leaders in an international conferences to say, what are going to be the rules of the road here? How are we going to use this gene editing? Are we going to allow people to make inheritable edits to their children? We can use it to cure diseases like sickle cell. It's already been used for that. And to cure congenital blindness and cancers. It's been used for some of that as well. But are we also going to use it to make designer babies? To say we want our kid to be a foot taller, or have this hair color or eye color, or maybe greater muscle mass? That's pretty easy to do with genetic editing. And so as she's worrying about that, something happens, which is a Chinese scientist, in sort of a rogue experiment, actually makes designer babies, edits the early stage embryos of what become twin girls in China, so they don't have the receptor that allows them to get HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. Well, everybody's kind of, Jennifer Doudna is at the meeting where he announces it, and there's this great shock. And so they keep working on how do we keep this genie in a bottle or put it back in the bottle, that we're not racing ahead to edit our children before we know the ethical implications. The second thing she does that made her an important hero for our time is that she and her competitor, Feng Zhang at MIT, turned their attention exactly a year ago to this new coronavirus pandemic. Because as I said, CRISPR, that's just a system for fighting viruses that bacteria use to fight viruses. And CRISPR is also a detection technology. It can spot any genetic sequence. So it can be used as a way to cut up invading viruses. It can be used as a way to create tools, simple desktop or kitchen countertop things like home pregnancy tests that can detect viruses, or for that matter, bacteria, or your gut microbiome, or cancer tumors. And they turn to that. But instead of fighting over patents and fighting over prizes, as soon as they make discoveries over this past year, they put it all on public servers for anybody to read and say, we're not asserting any patent rights to this. People can build on this to fight the coronavirus epidemic. And to me, that was a great thing, because even though people are motivated by, patents and prizes and fame and discovery, and certainly scientists, especially Jennifer Doudna, they like to make those discoveries first. They like to be the winner of a race to make discoveries. But it reminded them and all of us that science is a noble endeavor, that the real reason you go into it is you want to help humanity. And I hope that my book reaffirms the notion that science is not something to be feared. Even gene editing or virus immunity is not something, of course, to be feared. And people who are too afraid of science, who don't realize that nature is beautiful, they sometimes become intimidated, and sometimes they become anti-science or anti-vax. So I wanted this book to remind some people of a very simple fact, which is that nature is beautiful. And nature allows every creature, large and small, to use its cleverness or its talents or its strengths to help make itself healthier and stronger. That's what we do with CRISPR gene editing. That's what we do with our vaccines. So science is a noble calling. And I also hope, just as Jennifer Doudna found on her bed one day a story about the double helix of DNA, that some kid, maybe, your sons or daughters or nieces or nephews or whatever, will pick up my book or books like it and say, I get it. I love the beauty of science. I want to be like that. I want to help humanity by understanding the fundamental, wonderful secrets about how does life work on this planet. So I thank you for listening to me, and I'm really looking forward to answering some of your questions.
Mr. Isaacson, thank you so much for sharing that. Very
And
complete.
thank you. And Jeff, by the way, if I'm going to call you Jeff, please call me Walter.
All right, Walter, thank you. Walter, thank you so much for sharing that. I was fortunate enough to get to read an early copy of the book. And I was, among other things, so glad to learn the story. And I'm glad you mentioned her as well. But Rosalind Franklin, who, is one of those names that I think we should all know. And one of the things I enjoyed immensely about the book was seeing the incredible role that she played in probably the last large discovery many of us remember from a biology class long ago. And to see what has happened since then has been remarkable. So my college-bound nieces will be getting copies of this, and I think they'll.
I hope a couple of nephews too. We don't want boys to be left behind in this revolution. I'll tell you an interesting thing, since it's International Women's History Month and other things. 60% of the people now studying biology in college or graduate school are women. So, I don't want boys to be left behind either. So I just want to increase the total number of people, even if they don't decide to become, doctors or medical researchers, at least taking a few biology courses and maybe even a chemistry course, or just reading about the wonders of life. I think it's useful for all of us, even us grown-up students, to say, hey, I'm going to try to marvel at the beauty of nature.
Very, very well put. Well, thank you so much. I'd like to welcome Amy Raskin and Andrew Marshall, who will be moderating our Q&A session. Gene editing, as Walter has mentioned, has really been a profound advancement in the life sciences, and it's the exact kind of powerful secular theme that we seek to understand for our clients. And molecular medicine's been something that Amy has been exploring for well over a decade as an investor. And it's been one of the more enduring themes here for Chevy Chase Trust and part of our portfolio going back to when she joined the firm in 2014. Andrew Marshall is our lead healthcare analyst and a portfolio manager with a deep knowledge of the space. He's actually uncovered many of the companies that we've invested in on behalf of clients over the years. Both of them are longstanding fans of Walter and his writing, and I think both are also in a unique position to appreciate the code breaker on a different level. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleagues for a few questions.
Sure, I'll take it. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I enjoyed the book and your presentation immensely. I think John Meacham summed it up well. He said, "The Code Breaker is an urgent, sober, accessible, and altogether brilliant achievement. In my opinion, it's simply a must read for anyone interested in the future of healthcare, science, or humanity." So my colleague Andrew and I are honored to be able to ask you questions about the book. I'm just going to start with a simple one. What made you decide to write about the genomics or the biotech revolution now? I mean, you could have argued that we sequenced the first DNA over 15 years ago. People have been working with gene therapies. Was it the advent of CRISPR? And why did you decide to focus on Dr. Doudna? As you mentioned in the book, there was about a dozen or so scientists that made significant contributions to the discovery of CRISPR. Are you at all concerned that by putting her name in the title, she becomes synonymous with CRISPR at the expense of others for history?
Yes, well, I decided to do the life sciences a few years ago because, as I said, it's the great, as you know, Amy, better than anybody, it's the great innovation revolution of our time. And you're right, you can date it just like you can date the digital revolution, to the 1950s when they do the computer, the microchip, and the networks. You can date the onset in some ways to the Human Genome Project that in the year 2000 sequenced DNA. But the thing about sequencing DNA is we could read our DNA, but it actually didn't lead to quite as many things, I think, as Francis Collins and Eric Lander and others involved hoped. It became important not only to read the DNA, but to rewrite the DNA. And that's what these CRISPR tools and gene editing allow. So I felt the revolution really was taking a great leap forward when we've always had some gene editing tools, but when CRISPR came along. I've done books that are about a whole lot of people. I did a book called The Innovators, which was about everybody in the digital revolution. And sometimes I do biographies that focus just on one person, like Leonardo Da Vinci or Steve Jobs. I wanted to make this book a bit of a combination. So as you say, in the book, there's Feng Zhang. He's a big character. George Church, who you probably know pretty well, this mad scientist who's actually, if you scratch the surface, a wonderful gentleman. And there's Emmanuel Charpentier. All of those are characters. They probably all deserve their own book. But I wanted to show that science is a collaborative effort, but it's also driven by individuals who really get persistent and strong. And so with Jennifer, as I studied her more and more, and as I talked to everybody from Feng Zhang to Emmanuel to George, she was somebody who represented the whole sweep of things, beginning with reading the Double Helix and becoming friends of James Watson, and then discovering the structure of RNA, and then doing CRISPR, and then doing the public policy work, and then turning attention to the coronavirus. So in some ways, her narrative allowed all the strands I wanted to talk about to weave together. So the book has her as a central character, but it, I hope, like a quadruple helix, weaves together, other characters as well.
Well, that brings me to my next question, my follow-up question about this. So you started working on this book, obviously, years ago, and then the coronavirus pandemic happened and took over all of our lives. How did your research on the book impact how you processed the coronavirus? And how did the coronavirus impact your process on the book?
Well, the coronavirus impacted what I was processing on the book by reminding me that not only was this the most important revolution of our time, but that almost understated the case. It really hit home. We were going to live or die based on our ability to do things like program guide RNAs and messenger RNAs. So it made the book far more relevant. It also opened me up. I had a little bit, as Jennifer Doudna did, and Fong Zhang did, not George Church, he's out there. But Fong and Jennifer both were a little bit cautious about uses of CRISPR, and said at first they were kind of put off by the notion of making a lot, edits in, children in particular, our unborn children. But the notion of the coronavirus made it seem like, well, that's a little bit more complex. Maybe there are things we need to do to make our species healthier. And then you ask the other way around, how did it affect my research on the book? Well, I extended work on the book for, another year or so. I hadn't finished the book because the last quarter of the book is about, okay, now let's use these tools in our fight against coronavirus. And it was interesting because I had visited Emmanuel's lab in Berlin, where she's now working, and Jennifer's lab at Berkeley, and Fong Zhang's lab in Kendall Square in Cambridge. And, done my research in the labs. But now with the pandemic, I could be in their labs every day by Zoom. I was on all of their meetings. I watched as they did their experiments. They allowed me to lurk in their Slack channels. So it was a first time in my career as a reporter or as a writer where in real time I'm watching history being made. So I hope that excitement comes through at the end of the book.
Great. Well, just to echo the comments of Jeff and Amy, thank you so much for being with us today. And I think CRISPR is such a transformative technology. It's probably the most important change that a lot of folks aren't really aware of. And so I think your book will go a long way in distributing that knowledge. My responsibilities include understanding the disruptive changes related to molecular medicine, learning the nuances of different technologies and acronyms. Can definitely be challenging. CRISPR is, of course, no exception. So what was your path towards learning the science? What steps did you take? How difficult was it? If you could just tell us about your experience.
Yeah, the science is not or wasn't as difficult because I love biology and chemistry, but I'd never, majored in it and stuff. Having had to conquer the calculus of general relativity when I wrote about Einstein, that was really hard. The notion of how RNA has 4 letters and it's programmed to be messengers to make proteins in your cell, that was kind of fun to learn. And likewise, the coding of our gene, how DNA works, that was a lot of fun. And Jennifer Dowda, as well as Fong Zhang and George Church, were all really good guides. They'd sit down and explain it to me, allow me to be in their labs. And so at one point I said, well, if I'm going to understand this technology, we have a phrase down here in New Orleans, you learn to do by doing. So I went into Jennifer's lab at Berkeley and spent 2 days with a couple of her graduate students and actually edited the DNA using CRISPR. And then we did it in a human cell using CRISPR. Made edits and had those fluorescent reporter molecules you probably know about, to make sure, okay, yeah, it got edited. Now, lest you worry about what happened, we mixed it all with chlorine and poured it down a drain. So none of my organisms have gotten out in the world. But to me, it was fun learning about these things. And, this isn't a science text. This is a narrative. It's a biography. And so I really tried to learn and love the science, but maybe people will read the book and they'll want to drill deeper and they can read some textbooks on CRISPR. This isn't a textbook on microbiology or biochemistry.
Sure. No, I think that, having read a lot of books on the topic, this, the treatment of the biology is accessible for the layperson. So I think people will come away with, quite a bit of understanding regarding CRISPR and some of the mechanisms involved. And just going back to your experience actually doing the edit yourself. So, in your book, you talk about how relatively easy it was, and just acknowledging that you did have some help there with the lab, the people working in the lab. But just thinking about this accessibility and ease of use, does that cause any sort of concerns for you? Certainly in today's world where we're plagued by the scourge of tech hackers, computer hackers, however you want to define them, thinking about the prospect of biological hackers, somehow sounds even more alarming.
Yeah, there's a character in my book named Isaacson who's a biohacker. He's, understands biology well, and in his garage, he makes CRISPR kits, which he sells online. And he's even made CRISPR edits that allow you to block the myostatin regulator that regulates how big your muscles grow. And so he injected himself at one point with this to make his muscles bigger. And he even sent me a vaccine that he had concocted for coronavirus using CRISPR to edit. Now, trust me, I did not inject myself with that vaccine, but it did inspire me to become part of the clinical trial for the Pfizer vaccine. In other words, I think there is a role for citizens to play in science. I do worry about biohackers have malevolent intent. When I wrote about Einstein and then the invention of the bomb, it was like, okay, we have to figure out how to control the spread of nuclear bombs. Nuclear bombs are not something that some hacker can make in the basement. So with CRISPR, it is something that people can do. So it's going to be a little bit harder to control this technology. But as I explain in the book, I think there are ways to control it, especially control the delivering of it. And one of the chapters in the book is about a wonderful discovery done among people in Jennifer Doudna's team and funded by the Defense Department called anti-CRISPR, which is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a way to, if somebody creates a molecule or an organism that's been CRISPR edited and it's a problem, this is a way to reverse it.
It's fascinating, and I do think having an anti-CRISPR is going to be critical as the technology permeates. And I'll probably ask you about that a little bit later. But I recently heard you say that you think the biotech revolution may be 10 times larger than the digital revolution. And this is quite a statement given the extent to which digital technology has permeated all of our lives, especially now during coronavirus. But you also note in the book that Dr. Feng Zhang who is one of the most prominent CRISPR scientists and a fierce competitor of Dr. Doudna, was a student at Harvard the same time as Mark Zuckerberg. And in the book, you speculate which person, either Dr. Zhang or Zuckerberg, is going to have a bigger impact on our lives when we look back 20, 30 years from now. Last time I checked, Facebook had 2.8 billion monthly users, and is one of the largest companies in the world. So I'm just curious, why do you think that the digital revolution could be as big or bigger than the digital revolution, and the impact of Dr. Zhang could be as big, if not bigger, than Mark Zuckerberg's?
Yes, it's a great question. And I think coronavirus may say, okay, shows how important digital technology is. Here we are on StreamYard, and we've been on Zoom and other things. But you know what the coronavirus pandemic also tells us? It's how important it is for people to figure out how to make a messenger RNA vaccine, how to make drugs, how to make things that will fight it. And I suspect that the healthcare industry and pharmaceutical industry will be totally driven by these new genetic technologies, whether it's in cancer treatment, immunotherapy, finding uses of genes to do things like create vaccines or cures for diseases, and to do things like when Feng Zhang and Jennifer Doudna talk about creating a small testing kit in your home. I'm going to have lots of things in my kitchen, maybe. I might have an Amazon Echo. I might have an iPad or something. But I'll also have this home testing kit in which I can easily, like a home pregnancy kit, every day talk about what's on my microbiome, gut microbiome, and is there a cancer tumor that's been sequenced in me? Has that come back, or do I have any genetic problems, or do I have a virus? Do I have any bacteria infection? And those will be platforms, just like the iPhone was, upon which people will build apps and say, okay, I'm going to build an app that will help you figure out your blood thing, whatever. So I think that's going to grow. Now, look, I'm on Facebook, and I don't want to knock Facebook. My book is, sort of being promoted on Facebook as we speak. But Facebook, even with 2.8 billion people, That's fine, but it's not truly, it's a mixed blessing, first of all, to our democracy and our civil discourse. And it's not as important even as the coronavirus vaccine in some ways. So yeah, Zuckerberg's going to be great. And there'll be 3 billion people using his connectivity platform. But 10, 20 years from now, when we're able to edit our genes, when people are coding not games to play on Facebook, but they're coding ways to use molecules to make us healthier, to fight off viruses, I think that's going to have 10 times more impact. I got my iPhone here. I love my iPhone. It has apps on it. But I just think we'll have 10 times more impact when we start to be able to hack our own evolution for good or for bad. But come back, invite me back in 10, 15 years, and we'll invite Mark Zuckerberg and we'll invite Feng Zhang, and we'll see who turned out to be the most influential.
By the way, I agree with you, and I'd love to do that. So it's a date.
Well, we just have to get Mark and Feng to say yes. You and I will be there.
I could do that. And I would agree with you. I mean, we, as Jeff alluded to, we've been investing in molecular medicine companies for a long time, and I think the impact is going to be huge and bigger than the digital revolution. If you just think about the healthcare industry as 20% of GDP, new and how much chronic disease costs the healthcare system today, the impact is going to have dramatic consequences for our economy and for, as you said, the way healthcare is administered and the way we all live.
And by the way, it's not necessarily an either or. Kids
Right.
who learn how to digitally code, but also understand the code of life. Cameron Mirvold is a wonderful guy in my book. You probably know who he is. And he's somebody who is at that intersection of the digital revolution and the biotech revolution. And people who can use that set of skills, both computational biology, but, figure out both types of coding, that's going to lead to some amazing advances.
All right. Well, just keeping with this theme that Amy mentioned of drawing parallels between digital technology and biotechnology, one of the important themes of the book is that biotechnology is the next innovation revolution. So trying to put us, locate us on this arc of change. So thinking about digital technology as an analog, are we in the IBM mainframe room size computer stage of development, the homebrew computer club? Where do you see us in this timeline, and what do you think we need to keep this forward progress going?
It's a great question. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I'll say that, as Amy pointed out, maybe the invention of the huge mainframe, that stage hit when we sequenced the human DNA, when the Human Genome Project in the year 2000 or so was able to do the full sequencing of the gene. And as I said, the next big leap is when we figured out how to not just read our DNA, but edit our DNA. And to me, that was sort of like the advent of the personal computer and the advent of microchips that were powerful enough that we could all personalize our computers, and it would come home. We wouldn't have to go to the computer building at our university with punch cards and a shoe card, in a shoebox. We could have our own personal computers. So I think we're at that phase where we're finally having it become personal. And all revolutions kind of start with a big centralized technology, such as computers. And then when they truly become revolutions is when there's a decentralization, when it becomes more personal, when everybody can have their own computer or have their own iPhone, or their personalized medicine, or their personalized cancer treatments. And that's the stage we're getting to in the next 5 years.
That's great. That's very interesting. Thank you. And going back to the comment about coding and that coding is important, parents should encourage kids to code, and that maybe right now kids are focusing on the wrong kind of coding, and that going forward maybe the biological coding is going to be more important. But thinking about computer coding, there's a tremendous number of resources available online. You can buy software, you can set up a computer for a child to learn on. There are a lot of resources there. What can parents do to encourage or facilitate the kinds of coding you're thinking of?
Well, I'll say something a bit shameless, which is read my book and give my book to your kids, because I talk about the wondrous miracles of being able to say, here's the 4 letters, of DNA, and the similar, not quite the exact same, but similar 4 letters of RNA. And here's how they translate to each other. And here's how a really wonderful scientist, meaning Jennifer Doudna, was able to hack that code, to show how you can use a pair of scissors, basically an enzyme, but it's like a pair of scissors, and snip it. And I hope that then inspires people to read, other books or go online, because, understanding our genetic makeup is complicated in some ways, but it's wondrous in some ways, because they're not easy answers. If somebody says, is there a gene for empathy? Well, no, it's complicated. And I write a lot about James Watson, a controversial character who wrote the Double Helix. He has a schizophrenic son, and he's got racist views, and he's weird in all, some of his feelings about looking at things through a genetic lens. So there's warnings too you have to have of don't look at everything through a genetic lens, just like don't look at all connectivity as being through Facebook. So I think by reading about the people who made this technology, I hope it'll inspire a whole lot of kids to say, I'm going to learn a little bit more about not only how to code for my computer, not only Python and JavaScript, but I'm going to just learn what is a gene and what does a gene really do.
And to that end, a theme throughout many of your books, and certainly this one, is this intersection between science and the humanities. In the Steve Jobs book, you talk about how his calligraphy class changed his life. In this book, in the Codebreaker, you talk about how Dr. Doudna really admired her dissertation professor, Dr. Jack Shashak, and because he was able to connect disparate things from different fields. Do you think the truly great among us, the people who are going to change the world, have a rare ability to excel in multiple fields and make connections that in disparate fields that might confine others?
Yeah, that's where you see the patterns of nature, is when you're curious about everything. And the reason I wrote about Leonardo da Vinci right before this is because he was one of those people in history who wanted to learn everything he possibly could about everything that was possibly knowable. And so he loved everything from art and anatomy to zoology and math and music and everything else. And he saw those patterns across nature. And Vitruvian Man, that nude guy doing the jumping jacks in the circle and the square, is his drawing about the connection between the arts and the sciences, between the humanities and our technology. And that was where Steve Jobs, he stood at that intersection. And that's why I love Jennifer Doudna, and why I hope people who care about the humanities will read the book, because we're going to depend for the creativity, but also for the moral sense of not only engineers, not only scientists, but people who connect science to humanity, and people who have a sense of the social sciences and a sense of the arts and what makes our hearts sing and what makes our emotions go. And so if you're going to look for creativity, if you're going to look for places in which people are curious about all sorts of fields, and they're able to make those connections and patterns that connect the arts to the sciences.
And well, to follow that up on a less positive note, you also mentioned that many of the people who've changed the world, who grew up feeling isolated. You mentioned Dr. Doudna feeling isolated growing up in Hawaii, but Da Vinci and Einstein and Kissinger and Jobs all felt somewhat isolated in their childhood, and many of them have flaws in their personalities, if I could say it that way, that alienate others. And you mentioned that about James Watson, and you talk about him in the book. But you start part 8 of the book with Steve Jobs' Think Different ad. And I'm going to read it just because I think some people on the phone may have, or on the call may have forgotten it, but I do think it's pretty powerful. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs and square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see the genius, because the people who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are the ones who do. Do you agree with Jobs? Are a person's flaws and achievements inescapably interwoven? And if so, how does this impact your assessment of Dr. Doudna, who doesn't appear really to have a fatal flaw in her personality? Or does she, and we just don't know it?
I remember sitting in Steve Jobs' backyard in Palo Alto in 2011, when I think he realized he was not going to outrun the cancer anymore. And he read that to me. And actually, he didn't read it to me. He recited it to me from memory.
Wow.
That exact thing you did, every word he did. And by the end, he was crying. So that is almost a manifesto for Steve Jobs, but it became something deeply meaningful for myself, because I do think that people have that sort of passion. The people who sometimes feel they're misfits are the ones who get to change the world. And we could all, I mean, it's not like there are only a few. All of us sometimes wonder, okay, why am I here and how do I fit in? You know, Leonardo da Vinci, he grew up in a small village, the village of Vinci, and he goes to Florence as a young teenager. He's born out of wedlock, he's gay, he's distracted, you know, he's got all these quirks, and yet he figures out how he fits in to the city of Florence where the Renaissance is happening. And likewise, Jennifer Doudna grew up, tall, lanky, blonde girl with everybody else in her class in the small village in Hawaii where her family had moved, were Polynesian extraction. And so she said, how do I fit in? What am I? But we can all do that. I think that all of us at all times say, I'm a bit of a round peg in a square hole here, or I'm a bit of a misfit, a rebel. You know, I try to think different. And so, first of all, it's never lose your wonder about how do you fit in. Never lose your wonder about what we're doing in this cosmos and why. And never lose your curiosity and your sense that you should think different every now and then. You should think out of the box.
Great. Thank you. So just going back to a comment you made early on in your opening remarks about some of the developments that took place after some of the initial research was published. I think most of us inside private industry take for granted the intense competition behind the publication of research and award of intellectual property for those in academia. Given that your career and books span both business and academic worlds, how did you react to how that drama unfolded? Were you surprised by the events you described in the book?
Yeah, I think it's very important to celebrate entrepreneurship, business, and for that matter, intellectual property. Sometimes talk to my daughter's friends and they think all content should be free and that patents are bad. And I say, wait, all I've ever created in my life, you know, are things that are intellectual property. And likewise, Jennifer Doudna and the people who made those vaccines or whatever. So I believe that there's a triple helix in a way, which is basic academic research done at universities, federal funding that often funds basic research and other things at universities, and then corporations that commercialize what's done. And what they do is they bring things from bench to bedside. By that, I mean from the lab where all the researchers are on benches doing their test tubes to the bedside of the patient. And if you didn't have the intellectual property, you didn't have the commercialization, you wouldn't drive science forward the way it works. So I'm a big defender of the system we have. I also sometimes feel we go too far in the patent battles. And I think that's the case in this book, where Jennifer Doudna and her team with Emmanuel Charpentier are in this patent war that's 4 years old now, maybe 5 years old now, with Feng Zhang and the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. And I kind of understand each of them took out patents on how you use this as a gene editing tool, and the patent office kind of screwed it up and gave both sides patents. And now there's these patent interference trials, they're called, or whatever. Well, I remember when that happened with Texas Instruments and Intel, because they had both invented the microchip within a month of each other. And eventually Bob Noyce of Intel calls Jack Kilby of Texas Instruments, and there's a certain philosophy in business, which is let's quit fighting over divvying up the proceeds until we finish robbing the stagecoach. And so he says to Kilby, hey, let's just cross-license our patents, get the lawyers out of this one. And I hope at some point that happens between the Berkeley team and the MIT team, and they do that. But the good thing is when, as I mentioned earlier, when coronavirus struck, boom, they decided it wasn't just about patents. It's let's put this in the public domain. Let others build upon it. Because I do believe that Jennifer Doudna and Feng Zhang are both at heart motivated not by patents and not by profits, not even by prizes, but by doing things that help humanity. And to circle back to what Amy asked me and I didn't fully answer, does Jennifer Doudna have any of those flaws? Well, I think she's probably the least flawed character I've written about, meaning she's definitely doesn't have the aggressive personality of a Steve Jobs. But, she does have a competitive streak. And that's really, really good because competition pushes us forward. And she has a collaborative streak. She knows how to build teams. And maybe if there's a flaw, it's that in this patent battle, maybe we need to recalibrate that balance and say, all right, we fought this long enough. Let's make sure this technology, because you invest in CRISPR Therapeutics, which is Emmanuel's company. There's Caribou and Mammoth, which Jennifer founded. There's Editas, which Feng Zhang and Eric Lander founded. And those are all great companies, and they're going to be even greater once we get this patent battle behind us.
Yeah, no, I think it's right. When you're talking about her competitiveness comes through at times, but she's also a great team builder. And just because it is Women's History Month, I will say you also note that sometimes women can build better teams and be sort of more collaborative and share credit more than men tend to do. So I just that was an interesting aside that I picked up in the book. Wonder why. But I'm going to turn to a little bit of a more difficult subject matter, and that is the morality of genome editing. And I do think when people first hear the phrase genomic editing or editing your genome, they immediately go to the designer babies that you referenced earlier and the Brave New Worlds schema. But you explain why the topic is much more complex and even pose the question whether it is immoral not to modify people's genomes if the change could cure life-threatening diseases such as sickle cell or Huntington's disease. Can you expand on your thoughts about the morality of genome editing? And in your opinion, who should make the rules?
Right. And I see some of the questions in the question box, including one that says, am I minimizing the negative aspects of gene editing by saying how easy it will be and not worrying as much about designer babies? Well, you've read the book, so you know that there are multiple chapters, especially after the Chinese experiment creating designer babies, where we say, whoa, this could be bad. And there are two ways I think it could be particularly bad. One is if these gene edits at the genetic supermarket aren't going to be free, and by the way, they won't be free, Are we going to make it so that the rich get to buy better genes for their children in the long run? Are we going to encode the inequality we now have, exacerbate it, and sort of code it in the way Huxley warned us about Brave New World or Gattaca the movie? Secondly, I think the problem could be that, well, if we leave it to the individuals, you asked me who should make the decision. If each individual parents at a clinic can make a decision of what edits to do, and we're talking about couple of decades, 3 decades from now, because it's not safe to do it yet. It's too complicated for most genes to do it. Only for the very simple genes like sickle cell and cystic fibrosis and muscular dystrophy, Tay-Sachs and Huntington's. Those are simple ones, but the other ones are pretty complicated. But in a couple of decades, we're going to have to face this issue. Should we leave it to every individual? Well, if every individual, I know what I'd do if I were in the privacy, nobody was judging me, said, do you want your kid to be taller? I'd say, yeah, a foot taller. Do you want hair color? I'd pick the hair color. And you'd start picking different traits. I think it's better to say, no, we are going to create some social guidelines and legal restrictions and regulations. And by we, I don't mean the scientists and I don't mean the politicians. I mean we. Amy, me and you and Andrew and everybody listening, we're all going to have to understand, and it's a slippery slope. Once you say, I want my kid not to have Alzheimer's, not to have memory loss, then you're like, okay, but do you want to enhance the memory, make a child with, more intelligence? That's a slippery slope. And if you're going to face a slippery slope, because most slopes are slippery, you do it cautiously. You do it step by step, and preferably hand in hand. So I wrote the book so that people would understand. We have lots of cases in the book, thought experiments. Would you do Huntington's? Would you do sickle cell? Would you increase IQ if you could? Would you increase height if you could? And we, with a lot of Jennifer Doudna scientist input, but also religious people and thinkers and ethicists, I try to march through these case studies and say, which ones would you, the reader, want to have happen? And I think if we have a social discussion about this over the next 10 or 12 years, we won't be able to totally regulate it. There'll still be people using off-label things. But like a lot of things, we'll be able to say, here's the guidelines we're going to have. And I think that's one of the other reasons I wrote this book, is I want to start that discussion about what are the unintended consequences of designing our babies.
One of the unintended consequences or intended consequences would probably be that we would have fewer people with disabilities. As you mentioned in the book, disabilities often create fortitude, and you mentioned FDR and Miles Davis and some great contributors to the world who may have earned that fortitude, or some of that fortitude was forged by overcoming disabilities. And you talk about how society might lose grit, gratitude, and humility if we have fewer people with disabilities. How do you think about that? How do you leave it very open to the reader to come to his or her own conclusion, but what's your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the great thinkers in my book is a 17-year-old kid named David Sanchez, who's got sickle cell. And, he's been treated for it, and he doubles over in pain whenever he tries to play basketball. And they say, with CRISPR, we might be able to edit it so that your children won't have it. And he says, that's great, that's cool. But then he says, but I think it should be up to my children before we do the edits. And they say, why? Would you want to have children? He said, well, sickle cells taught me a lot of things, as you put it, grit and fortitude and empathy and patience. And then he changes and, it's hard. He says, but maybe I can teach them another way. So these are the things we have to think about. What are true disabilities and what are things that forge character? As you said, Franklin Roosevelt's character was forged by having polio. That said, I don't know anybody who doesn't have their kid take the polio vaccine, even at the risk that they won't be a Franklin Roosevelt. We want to wipe out polio. So that's why, the book takes it step by step and says, what are the things we do want to eliminate? Polio, maybe sickle cell anemia, But do we really want to try to cure all mental issues, including depression? Maybe, but maybe, these things are interconnected. So I think we have to be careful before we get into things like personality and the traits that make us human. I'd start with the simple ones, like let's get rid of Huntington's disease and let's get rid of sickle cell anemia for those who don't want their family to have it.
Great. Definitely very important, just questions that we've never really been in a position to ask or answer before. So definitely thought provoking. I've had the opportunity to attend enough molecular medicine events and conferences to have crossed paths with a few of the folks in your book, like Kevin Davies and a number of the people at the publicly traded CRISPR companies. We thought it would be fun to include a question from a CRISPR insider. And so I asked Dr. John Leonard, CEO of Intellia, if he would do me the honor of providing a question, and he graciously agreed.
Oh, that's cool. Intellia is a great company.
Absolutely. He asks, we are all excited by what we believe the technology can do, and we know the pace of innovation accelerates daily. What do you think is the biggest technical hurdle to overcome in the next couple of years to maximally open up what is possible with gene editing? And conversely, what disappointments do you think we will identify, say, 25 years from now, where we will say that the promise of gene editing fell short of our expectations?
One of the problems of gene editing is, off target, meaning you're trying to edit one gene and you have off target things. That actually is being solved relatively well. Beam Therapeutics, if you want to look at a company doing it, with David Liu at Harvard, is using things like base editing and prime editing to make sure we minimize off-target edits. So to answer your question, the thing that I think will be the most difficult is the delivery system. I was able to edit a gene, but to be able to deliver the edits into the right body cells, or for that matter, into an embryo or a sperm cell, or to take a CRISPR system that can kill coronavirus, the way bacteria use it to kill viruses. That's pretty easy to do. Carver is something that's been done out of the Fengjiang world, and Pac-Man is being done on the West Coast. But the delivery mechanism of getting it, say, into the lung cells or whatever the infected cells are, that's still been the problem. So if I'm looking, as you would, for companies that are doing a great job, you look at Moderna and you say, wow, they did a wonderful job with messenger RNA. But don't forget, they also did a wonderful job with the delivery mechanism, the lipid nanoparticles that are able to get it into our cells. So I know that's getting a bit technical, but I think investors should look at those companies that know how to safely deliver new molecular tools. So that's where I'll be looking. And I think, maybe 10, 15 years from now, where we're going to look back and say, we may have made some mistakes, is genes are kind of complex. And you get rid of the gene, as the Chinese doctor did, for the receptor that causes AIDS, the HIV receptor. It also affects West Nile disease or malaria. So I think we have to understand the complexity of the human genome, those 3 billion base pairs of letters that nature took 1 million years, or nature's God took 1 million years to weave together. Before we mess with it too much, we have to make sure, all right, if we take out that, will it also affect this?
Great. No, absolutely. And I guess just maybe ending on for me, final question for me, ending on a forward-looking idea. So we've, over the course of our conversation and in your remarks, we talked about a lot of the innovators who have really defined how we think and live. And you mentioned earlier on the smallest units of matter. atom, digital information, the byte, and now DNA and RNA within biology. So these small entities playing an outsized role in all of our lives. So just thinking about these almost consecutive innovation revolutions that we've had, and thinking about the biological revolution that we're on the cusp of, what's next? If we're going to look out 25 plus years or so, given your background, having written about so many of these innovation revolutions, what do you see as the next one? How do we top the ability to write the code of life?
I think the combination of information technology, including artificial intelligence, data mining, and all that the IT and digital revolution will coincide with the life sciences revolution, the biotech revolution. And all medicine and all things about life will become very personalized. Because as I said earlier, one of the almost inevitable arcs of innovation is that things become more accessible, more democratized, and more personal. So I think soon, just as we now know that cancer is not one disease or even 100 diseases, but it could be a very personal thing. And likewise, any infections you have, any health you have, any predispositions you have are all very personal. I think connecting our understanding of the genetic basis of organic life with the data mining capabilities of the digital revolution will be so that almost everything we do for our health, but well-being, and will become part of what I would call the personalization revolution. No two diseases are alike, no two cancers are alike, no two personalities are alike. And I hope that makes us celebrate the diversity of the human species instead of trying to edit out that diversity.
I certainly, for those of us with loved ones who have chronic diseases, I hope you're right, and I hope it comes as soon as possible. I want to be respectful of your time and everybody's time, but so my last question, which was sent to us by a client before the event, was, what's next for you after you finish the publicity for this book? And obviously this was certainly a labor of love, I'm sure. Who would you like to write about next? Is there any 2 or 3 candidates that have been sort of?
Yeah, I haven't decided. I always take about 6 months and chew on things. And, there's certain contemporary characters. I have an enormous respect for Bill Gates, both as an entrepreneur, as a business leader, and then as a philanthropist and as a scientist. I'm watching Elon Musk like everybody. I think we might be still in the middle of that story. We have to figure out how that one turns out. Jeff Bezos is, of course, the great entrepreneur of our time. Historically, there's Marie Curie, who won the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in chemistry, with Jennifer and Emmanuel being the 6th and 7th. So those are the people I'm kicking around. Sometimes I kick around Louis Armstrong because I'm sitting here in the French Quarter in New Orleans and like the music and think that there was a great creative invention. But to be honest with you, I really haven't picked my next subject yet because I'm still fascinated by Jennifer Doudna, gene editing, and the future of the human race.
Well, we can't wait. This was, as I said at the beginning, this is a fabulous book, and everybody should read it and give it to every member of their family. And I'm going to turn it over back to Jeff Whitaker for some concluding remarks, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Amy. And thank you, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Walter, for sharing your thoughts and enthusiasm on this subject, and particularly for doing it on the release date, which I'm sure is quite a busy day. And I think I take away from this the value of curiosity and encouraging curiosity in ourselves and in others. And you've certainly, I think, given us a lot to think about on that front. Amy and Andrew, thank you so much for guiding us through a whole set of very interesting topics. And to our clients who've been able to join us today, thank you for your time. And I hope that you found this also very compelling and thought-provoking. And I know you're going to enjoy reading The Codebreaker. So for now, goodbye, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.